Reba Mcentire gave a homeless man a chance to sing, and America stopped to watch. The autumn wind cut through Nashville's streets like a blade of forgotten dreams, carrying with it the scent of fallen leaves and broken promises. Michael Dawson pulled his threadbare coat tighter around his shoulders, the fabric so worn that the original color had long since faded into a memory of better days. His fingers, once steady enough to guide young minds through the complexities of music theory, now trembled as he clutched a paper bag containing his meager dinner, a stale sandwich and lukewarm coffee from the shelter downtown. 5 years had passed since the accident that shattered his world into a million irreparable pieces. 5 years since Sarah's laughter had echoed through their small farmhouse kitchen, since 8-year-old Tommy had practiced piano scales under his patient guidance, since life had meaning beyond mere survival. The memory of that rainy Tuesday evening still haunted him. The phone call from the hospital, the sterile smell of disinfectant, the doctor's words that fell like hammer blows. "I'm sorry, Mr. Dawson. We did everything we could." Michael's steps echoed hollow against the concrete as he made his way through the alley behind Music Row, where dreams were born and died with equal frequency. The irony wasn't lost on him that he now lived as a ghost in the very city that celebrated the art form he had devoted his life to teaching. His students at Riverside Elementary had called him Mr. Music, their young faces lighting up when he'd pull out his guitar during afternoon lessons. Now that same guitar, battered and scarred like its owner, was the only companion he had left in this world of shadows. The medical bills had consumed everything. Sarah's treatment, Tommy's brief stay in intensive care, the funeral costs. They had devoured his savings, his house, his future, with the voracious appetite of a monster that feeds on human suffering. The school district, facing budget cuts, had eliminated his position 6 months after the accident. "We're sorry, Michael," the principal had said, unable to meet his eyes. If circumstances were different, but circumstances weren't different, and sympathy doesn't pay rent or put food on the table. Tonight, as he did every evening when the famous venues came alive with music, Michael found himself drawn to the back entrance of the Grand Ole Opry, like a moth to flame. If you've ever felt the pull of something greater than yourself, something that speaks to your very soul, then you know the magnetic force that drew him here night after night. Please, take a moment to subscribe to our channel and share your thoughts in the comments below. Where are you watching us from tonight? Your stories and support mean the world to us, and we love hearing how these tales of hope and redemption touch your hearts across this great nation of ours. The legendary venue stood before him like a cathedral of dreams deferred. Through the service entrance, he could hear the sound of instruments being tuned, voices warming up, the controlled chaos that preceded every performance. Reba Mcentire was scheduled to perform her annual benefit concert tonight, and the thought of hearing her voice, even from this distance, even through brick walls and closed doors, sent a familiar ache through his chest. He remembered dancing with Sarah to "Consider Me Gone" in their living room, Tommy giggling as he spun between their legs. Michael settled against the cold brick wall, pulling his knees to his chest for warmth. His guitar case, held together with duct tape and prayers, rested beside him like a faithful dog. The case bore stickers from music stores that no longer existed, festivals he'd attended in what felt like another lifetime. Inside, wrapped in an old T-shirt to protect it from the elements, lay his 1987 Martin acoustic, a graduation gift from his parents when he'd earned his music education degree. It was worth more than everything else he owned combined, but he'd rather starve than sell it. Some things, he'd learned, were more valuable than money. The security guard's flashlight beams swept past his hiding spot, and Michael instinctively pressed himself deeper into the shadows. Ray Sullivan had been making his rounds for the past hour, checking the perimeter before the evening's high-profile event. Michael had observed him before, a kind-faced man in his 50s who always seemed to move with purpose rather than aggression. Unlike some of the other security personnel who treated homeless individuals like vermin to be exterminated, Ray had never directly confronted him, though Michael was certain the guard was aware of his presence. Inside the venue, the rehearsal began in earnest. Reba's unmistakable voice floated through the walls like honey, mixed with heartbreak, each note perfectly placed, each phrase delivered with the kind of emotional precision that comes from decades of connecting with audiences. Michael closed his eyes and let the music wash over him, temporarily drowning out the constant noise of hunger, cold, and despair that had become the soundtrack to his existence. Without conscious thought, His hands found their way to his guitar. The case opened with a soft click, revealing the instrument that had been his companion through every joy and sorrow of his adult life. The wood was scarred, the finish dulled by countless performances in church basements, school auditoriums, and coffee shops that existed only in memory now. But when his fingers found the familiar frets, when his thumb brushed across the strings in a gentle pattern, the guitar sang with the same sweet voice it had always possessed. "Consider me gone," Michael whispered, his voice barely audible above the autumn wind. The words came automatically, muscle memory from years of singing along to the radio, while Sarah cooked dinner and Tommy did homework at the kitchen table. His voice, though roughened by exposure and grief, still carried the warmth that had once filled a classroom with wonder, still possessed the emotional honesty that had made him an effective teacher and a decent man. The song built slowly, Michael's fingers finding complex chord progressions that spoke to years of formal training and natural talent. His voice grew stronger with each verse, the cold air crystallizing his breath as emotions he'd kept buried for 5 years began to surface. This wasn't performance. This was prayer, confession, and eulogy, all rolled into one desperate plea to the universe that had taken everything from him. Ray Sullivan stopped mid-stride during his security round, his hand instinctively moving to his radio before freezing in place. In 15 years of working venue security, he'd heard thousands of performances, witnessed hundreds of rehearsals, and learned to distinguish between genuine talent and wishful thinking. The voice drifting from the alley behind the loading dock possessed something rare, a quality that couldn't be taught in any music school or manufactured in any studio. It carried the weight of real experience, the kind of emotional truth that audiences craved but rarely found. The security guard approached cautiously, his flashlight lowered to avoid startling the singer. What he found defied every expectation. The homeless man he'd been quietly monitoring for weeks wasn't just humming along to the music bleeding through the walls. He was creating something beautiful, something that belonged on the very stage where legends had stood for generations. Ray's hand moved away from his radio and toward his phone. Carter Williams, Reba's musical director, needed to hear this. Michael, lost in the music and memories it evoked, remained unaware of his audience. The song had transported him to a place beyond the alley, beyond the cold, beyond the daily struggle for dignity in a world that had forgotten his name. In this moment, he was simply a man with a guitar, sharing his story with the night sky and anyone willing to listen. The notes hung in the air like stars, beautiful and distant, carrying with them the echo of dreams that refused to die completely. As the final chord faded into silence, Michael opened his eyes to find Ray Sullivan standing 10 feet away, neither threatening nor dismissive, but watching with the expression of someone who had just witnessed something extraordinary. The two men looked at each other across the divide of circumstance and social status, united for a moment by the universal language of music that recognizes no boundaries of wealth or position. "That was beautiful, son," Ray said softly, his voice carrying genuine respect rather than the patronizing tone Michael had grown accustomed to hearing. "How long have you been playing?" Michael's first instinct was to close the guitar case and disappear into the maze of Nashville's back alleys, to return to the safety of invisibility that had protected him from further disappointment. But something in Ray's demeanor, perhaps the way he'd called him son instead of buddy or pal, those generic terms people used when they didn't want to acknowledge your humanity, made him pause. "Since I was 12, Michael replied, his voice hoarse from disuse and emotion. "My father taught me the basics, but I studied formally in college. I used to teach music at an elementary school in—" He trailed off, realizing how pathetic his current situation must seem to someone with a steady job and a warm place to sleep. That was a long time ago. Ray nodded, processing this information with the careful consideration of someone who understood that every person carried a story worth hearing. He'd seen enough in his years of security work to know that the line between respectability and destitution was thinner than most people wanted to believe. Economic catastrophe, medical emergency, personal tragedy, any number of circumstances could transform a contributing member of society into someone that others crossed the street to avoid. "I've got someone inside who should hear you play," Ray said, making a decision that would alter the trajectory of multiple lives. "Would you be willing to come with me?" Michael's laugh held no humor, only the bitter recognition of impossibility. "Look at me, sir. I haven't had a proper shower in 3 days. My clothes haven't seen a washing machine in weeks. I don't belong anywhere near a place like this, especially not tonight with all those important people inside. Music doesn't care what you're wearing, Ray replied, echoing words that would prove prophetic. And if it's real music, the kind I just heard, then it deserves to be heard by people who understand its value. The weight of Ray's offer hung between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm. Michael stared at the service entrance, knowing that beyond those doors lay a world he'd been exiled from, a community of artists and music lovers who would see only his circumstances, not his talent. But Ray's hand was extended, not in charity but in genuine invitation, and for the first time in 5 years, Michael Dawson faced a choice that might lead somewhere other than deeper into the darkness that had claimed his life. Michael began, his voice catching on words that felt too large for his throat. The logical part of his mind screamed warnings about humiliation, about the inevitable moment when security would escort him out in front of hundreds of Nashville's elite. But another part, a part that had been sleeping for so long he'd forgotten it existed, whispered something different. What if this was the moment he'd been waiting for without knowing it? What if 5 years of suffering had led to this single opportunity? Ray seemed to sense his internal struggle. "My name's Ray Sullivan," he said, extending his hand properly. "I've been working security here longer than some of these musicians have been alive. I've seen real talent, and I've seen people pretending to have it. What I heard just now, that wasn't pretending." Michael looked down at his own hands, calloused from street life, but still bearing the telltale fingertip indentations of a serious guitarist. Slowly he reached out and shook Ray's hand, feeling the firm grip of a man who understood the value of an honest handshake. "Michael Dawson," he replied, surprised by how foreign his own name sounded when spoken as an introduction, rather than mumbled to social workers or shelter volunteers. "Well, Michael Dawson," Ray said with a slight smile, "there's someone inside who needs to meet you. His name is Carter Williams, and he's got an ear for music that's made more careers than most people in this town would care to admit. You willing to take a chance?" The service door beckoned like a portal to another dimension. Michael knew that stepping through it would change everything, though he couldn't yet imagine how completely. His guitar case felt heavier as he lifted it, weighted with the expectations of a moment that seemed too good to be real. "I suppose," he said quietly, "I don't have much left to lose." Ray led him through a maze of corridors that hummed with the energy of preparation. The walls were lined with photographs of country music legends, their faces frozen in moments of triumph that seemed to mock Michael's current circumstances. Dolly Parton smiled from one frame, Johnny Cash brooded from another, and Hank Williams Sr. gazed out with eyes that seemed to understand something about hardship and redemption. The air itself felt charged with possibility and the weight of musical history. They passed dressing rooms where backup singers warmed up their voices, technical areas where sound engineers fine-tuned equipment that cost more than Michael had earned in his last year of teaching, and catering stations laden with food that made his empty stomach clench with hunger. Nobody paid them much attention. Ray's security badge opened doors and deflected questions, while Michael's appearance simply rendered him invisible to people accustomed to seeing service workers and vendors moving through the backstage areas. "Carter!" Ray called out as they approached a man in his early 50s, standing near the mixing board, wearing headphones around his neck like a badge of office. Carter Williams looked exactly like what Central Casting would order for the role of music industry veteran: graying beard, expensive jeans, and the kind of weathered confidence that comes from decades of making split-second decisions about other people's dreams. Carter glanced up from his tablet, clearly annoyed at the interruption. "Ray, we're 30 minutes from curtain. Whatever this is about, can it wait until after the show?" "Trust me," Ray said, his tone carrying the weight of their 15-year working relationship. "This can't wait. You need to hear this man sing." For the first time, Carter's attention shifted to Michael, and the music director's expression went through a rapid series of changes: confusion, skepticism, and barely concealed disdain. The homeless man standing before him looked like he'd stepped out of a cautionary tale about the music business, rather than someone who belonged backstage at one of Nashville's most prestigious venues. "Ray, what exactly are you thinking?" Carter asked, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow managed to convey both concern and professional irritation. "We've got donors paying $5,000 a plate out there, the governor's in the front row, and you want me to listen to—" He gestured vaguely at Michael's appearance without finishing the sentence. Michael felt the familiar burn of shame rising in his chest, the same feeling he'd experienced countless times over the past 5 years when his circumstances spoke louder than his humanity. He took a step backward, ready to retreat to the relative safety of the alley where expectations were lower and disappointment was impossible. "Give him 2 minutes," Ray insisted, moving slightly to block Michael's escape route. 2 minutes, and if I'm wrong, I'll personally escort him out and we'll never speak of this again. But if I'm right, and I know I am, then we're about to witness something special. Carter checked his watch, a gesture that seemed to encompass all the pressures of coordinating a major live event. Backup dancers were running through final rehearsals in an adjacent space. Catering staff were preparing for the intermission reception, and somewhere in the building, Reba Mcentire was preparing to take the stage for a performance that would raise hundreds of thousands of dollars for music education programs across Tennessee. "Fine," Carter said finally, the word carrying the weight of someone accustomed to making quick decisions in high-pressure situations. 2 minutes. But if this goes sideways, Ray, it's on you. Michael's hands trembled as he opened his guitar case for the second time that evening. The familiar weight of the instrument provided some comfort, but he was acutely aware that every eye in the immediate vicinity had turned toward him. A few members of Reba's band had noticed the commotion and were watching with the casual interest of professionals observing an unexpected development in their routine. "What would you like me to play?" Michael asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Whatever brought Ray running to find me," Carter replied, crossing his arms in a posture that suggested professional skepticism tempered by genuine curiosity. "And don't think about the audience, just play like you were playing outside." Michael nodded, understanding instinctively that this was about more than demonstration, it was about authenticity. He settled the guitar against his body, feeling the familiar grooves where his arms had rested during thousands of hours of practice and performance. The instrument felt alive in his hands, responding to his touch like an old friend who had never forgotten their shared language. The opening chords of "Consider Me Gone" filled the backstage area, but this wasn't the polished studio version that radio stations played. This was the song stripped down to its emotional core, played by someone who understood intimately what it meant to be left behind by circumstances beyond control. Michael's voice, when it joined the guitar, carried 5 years of accumulated pain and the accumulated wisdom that comes from losing everything and continuing to breathe anyway. The effect was immediate and profound. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. A backup singer who'd been warming up her voice fell silent. Even the catering staff paused in their preparations, unconsciously drawn to a sound that demanded attention not through volume or flash, but through sheer emotional honesty. This wasn't performance, it was testimony, delivered by someone who had earned the right to speak about loss and longing through lived experience, rather than artistic imagination. Carter Williams had heard thousands of auditions, impromptu performances, and professional showcases during his career in the music industry. He developed the ability to assess talent quickly and accurately, separating genuine ability from enthusiasm, technical skill from emotional connection, commercial potential from mere competence. But what he was hearing now defied easy categorization. The homeless man standing before him wasn't just singing Reba's song, he was inhabiting it, transforming it into something personal and universal simultaneously. When the last note faded into the charged silence of the backstage area, Carter found himself facing a decision that would require him to choose between professional caution and artistic instinct. The safe choice would be to thank Michael politely, perhaps slip him some money for food, and return to the business of managing a high-profile charity event. The dangerous choice would be to trust what his ears were telling him, to believe that sometimes the most important music comes from the most unexpected sources. "Son of a bitch," Carter whispered, running his hand through his graying hair. "Ray, where the hell did you find him?" But before Ray could answer, another voice cut through the backstage chatter, clear and commanding and unmistakably familiar to everyone within earshot. "I'd like to know that myself," said Reba Mcentire, stepping into the circle that had formed around Michael's impromptu performance. The queen of country music herself had been drawn by the same magnetic quality that had stopped Carter's heart and validated Ray's instincts, and now stood facing the homeless man whose voice had just turned her backstage area into a concert venue. Michael's guitar nearly slipped from his hands as he found himself staring at one of his musical heroes. Reba Mcentire stood before him in her pre-show attire, a stunning sequined gown that caught the backstage lighting like captured starlight, her famous red hair styled to perfection, her makeup flawless, despite the controlled chaos of preparation surrounding them. But what struck Michael most was her eyes, warm, intelligent, and completely focused on him, rather than looking through him as so many people had done over the past 5 years. "Ma'am?" Michael stammered, instinctively starting to pack his guitar away. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt your preparations. Ray here was just being kind, and You should probably tell me your name," Reba interrupted gently, her Oklahoma accent wrapping around the words like a comfortable blanket, "because what I just heard from my dressing room was the most honest interpretation of that song I've encountered since I recorded it 15 years ago." The circle of onlookers had grown to include most of Reba's touring band, several members of her management team, and a handful of venue staff who had abandoned their pre-show duties to witness whatever was unfolding in this corner of the backstage area. Michael could feel their collective attention like a physical weight, pressing down on his shoulders with the accumulated expectations of people who lived and breathed music professionally. "Michael Dawson," he replied, his voice gaining strength from some deep reservoir of dignity that 5 years of hardship hadn't completely depleted. "And I want you to know that your music has been a source of comfort during some very difficult times in my life." Reba's expression softened with recognition of something familiar, the look of someone who had been touched by genuine loss rather than superficial hardship. In her decades-long career, she had met thousands of fans, but experience had taught her to distinguish between those who loved her music and those who had been saved by it. Michael Dawson clearly belonged to the latter category. "Tell me about those difficult times," she said, settling onto a nearby equipment case with the casual grace of someone completely comfortable in her own skin. The gesture transformed the backstage area into an intimate space, despite the presence of dozens of people preparing for one of Nashville's biggest charity events of the year. Michael hesitated, glancing around at the faces surrounding them. These were music industry professionals, people whose time was valuable and whose attention was usually focused on commercial considerations rather than personal tragedies. But something in Reba's demeanor encouraged honesty over diplomacy, authenticity over performance. "I lost my wife and son in a car accident 5 years ago," he began, his voice steady, despite the tremor in his hands. "I was a music teacher at an elementary school in rural Tennessee. The medical bills, the funeral costs, losing my job, it all happened so fast that I couldn't catch my breath. One day I was teaching kids to love music, and the next I was sleeping in my car, then in shelters and finally on the streets." The backstage chatter had faded to complete silence. Even the most cynical industry veterans found themselves caught up in a story that reminded them why they had fallen in love with music in the first place. Its power to connect human beings through shared experience and emotional truth. "Music was all I had left," Michael continued, his fingers absently finding familiar chord positions on his guitar neck. "When everything else was gone, when I couldn't afford rent or groceries or hope, I still had these songs. Your songs especially. They reminded me that other people had survived loss, that there was beauty in the world even when I couldn't see it myself." Reba nodded slowly, processing not just Michael's words but the way he spoke them, without self-pity or manipulation, simply a statement of fact. She had heard countless sob stories during her career, most of them designed to elicit sympathy or open doors. This felt different. This felt real. "What did you teach?" she asked, genuinely curious about the life this man had built before tragedy tore it down. "Elementary music education," Michael replied, a ghost of a smile crossing his features. "3rd through 6th grade. I ran the school choir, organized talent shows, taught basic music theory. I had this belief that every child deserved to experience the joy of making music, regardless of their family's economic situation or their natural ability." "Had?" Reba caught the past tense immediately. "Have," Michael corrected himself, the smile becoming more genuine. "I guess some beliefs survive even when everything else falls apart. I still believe that music can save people, even if I couldn't save myself." Carter Williams had been listening to this exchange with growing amazement. In his experience, genuine talent and compelling personal stories rarely converged so dramatically. The music industry was full of skilled performers with manufactured backstories and authentic characters who couldn't carry a tune. Michael Dawson appeared to be that rarest of combinations, someone with both the ability to move audiences and the life experience to give that ability meaning. "Michael," Carter interrupted gently, "what you just played for us, was that exactly as written, or did you arrange it yourself?" "I added some finger-picking patterns that seemed to fit the emotional content," Michael replied, immediately understanding the technical nature of the question. "The original recording has more production, obviously, but I've always believed that a good song should be able to stand alone with just voice and guitar." "Play something else," Reba said suddenly, her tone carrying the authority of someone accustomed to making decisions that changed people's lives. "Something original, if you have it." Michael's eyes widened with surprise and terror in equal measure. His original compositions were the most personal part of his musical life, songs written in the depths of grief and despair that he'd never shared with another human being. They were too raw, too honest, too revealing to be performed for an audience, especially an audience of music industry professionals who might judge them by commercial standards. "I don't know if that's appropriate," he said carefully. "My songs are quite personal, and this is your event, your evening. I've already taken up too much of your time." "Time?" Reba laughed, a sound like silver bells mixed with Tennessee whiskey. "Honey, I've been doing charity benefits for 20 years, and they all follow the same script. Cocktails, dinner, speeches about the importance of music education, a performance of my greatest hits, and everyone goes home feeling good about writing a check. Tonight feels different. Tonight feels like something important is happening." She stood up from the equipment case and moved closer to Michael, her presence commanding but not intimidating. "You know what I love most about country music? It tells the truth. It talks about real life, the good, the bad, and the ugly. It doesn't pretend that everything works out fine, or that positive thinking can solve every problem. It just tells the story, and lets people decide what to do with it." Michael looked into her eyes and saw something unexpected, not pity or charity, but recognition. This was one artist acknowledging another, one storyteller recognizing someone who had stories worth telling. It was the kind of professional respect he hadn't experienced since his teaching days, and it awakened something in him that he'd thought was permanently dormant. "I wrote this for my wife," he said quietly, settling his guitar into playing position. "It's called Forever's Not Long Enough, and I've never played it for anyone else." The backstage area seemed to hold its breath as Michael's fingers found the opening chords. This wasn't the confident strumming of a cover song, but something more tentative, more vulnerable, the musical equivalent of opening a diary to strangers. But as the melody developed, as Michael's voice found its way into lyrics that had been carved from pure emotion, something magical began to happen. The song was devastating in its simplicity and honesty. No clever wordplay or commercial hooks, just a man's attempt to capture the essence of love that had been cut short by circumstances beyond anyone's control. It spoke of morning coffee shared in comfortable silence, of small hands reaching for guidance, of dreams interrupted by the cruel randomness of tragedy. But it also spoke of gratitude for time that had been given, of love that persisted beyond physical presence, of hope that refused to die completely even in the face of overwhelming loss. When the last chord faded into silence, Michael looked up to find tears in Reba's eyes. Not the carefully controlled emotion of a performer, but the genuine response of someone who had been moved by art that transcended entertainment and touched something deeper. Around the circle, hardened industry professionals were wiping their eyes or staring at the floor, each processing their own response to a song that demanded emotional honesty from everyone who heard it. "Carter," Reba said, without taking her eyes off Michael, her voice carrying a tone that her musical director had learned to recognize over years of collaboration. It was the voice she used when she'd made a decision that wasn't open for debate, when artistic instinct overruled commercial consideration. "How much time do we have before curtain?" 15 minutes, Carter replied, though something in his tone suggested he already knew where this conversation was heading. "Change the set list," Reba said, finally turning to face her musical director. "I want Michael to join me on stage tonight." The reaction was immediate and electric. Band members exchanged glances of surprise and concern. Management team members began whispering urgently among themselves. Carter's face went through a rapid series of expressions as he calculated the logistics, legal implications, and potential consequences of what Reba was proposing. "Reba," her tour manager stepped forward, a woman in her 40s whose job was to anticipate and prevent exactly this kind of spontaneous deviation from carefully planned events. "We can't just add someone to the show without insurance clearance, without sound checks, without..." "Without what?" Reba interrupted, her tone carrying just enough edge to remind everyone present who made the final decisions about her performances. "Without making sure he's qualified? I think we just established that without making sure the audience will connect with him? Honey, if that song doesn't move people, then they don't have hearts to move." Michael found himself caught in the center of a professional hurricane, watching industry veterans debate the merits and risks of including him in one of Nashville's most prestigious events. Part of him wanted to speak up, to release Reba from what was clearly an impulsive gesture, born of momentary emotion, but another part, the part that had survived 5 years on the streets by learning to recognize genuine opportunities when they presented themselves, understood that this moment was the answer to prayers he'd stopped believing would be heard. "Ms. Mcentire," Michael interjected quietly, his voice cutting through the heated discussion among her team. "I appreciate what you're trying to do, but these people are right to be concerned. I'm not prepared for something like this. I don't have stage clothes, I haven't rehearsed with your band, and frankly, I'm not sure I'm emotionally ready to perform in front of an audience that size." Reba turned to face him fully, and Michael saw in her expression the same determination that had carried her from small-town Oklahoma to the pinnacle of country music success. "Honey, do you think I was ready the first time I stepped on the Grand Ole Opry stage? Do you think any of us were ready for our first big break? Preparation is overrated. Heart isn't." "But the audience," Michael protested, gesturing vaguely toward the main theater where Nashville's elite were finishing their pre-show cocktails. "These are sophisticated people who paid serious money to hear you perform. They're not expecting some homeless guy with a beat-up guitar to interrupt their evening. Then maybe it's time they got something they weren't expecting," Reba replied with a smile that held just a hint of mischief. Country music didn't become the voice of American working people by playing it safe or worrying about what sophisticated audiences wanted to hear. Carter Williams had been quiet during this exchange, but now he stepped forward with the air of someone who had reached a decision. "If we're going to do this," he said, his tone suggesting he couldn't believe he was agreeing to such spontaneous chaos, "we need to make it work professionally. Michael, can you play Consider Me Gone the way you just did it, but with our full band backing you?" Michael nodded slowly, his musician's brain automatically working through the technical requirements. "I'd need to know what key you typically perform it in, and whether you want the full arrangement or something stripped down to accommodate acoustic guitar." "We'll keep it simple," Carter decided, already moving into problem-solving mode. "Guitar, bass, drums, maybe some steel guitar for color. Nothing too complex, we want your voice to be the focus." He turned to address the growing circle of musicians who had gathered to witness this unprecedented backstage drama. "Tommy, can you run the basic progression with Michael? Sarah, give him a quick sound check on stage. We've got exactly 10 minutes to make this work." The next few minutes passed in a blur of controlled chaos that would have been overwhelming if Michael hadn't spent years managing the logistics of school performances with limited resources and endless complications. The Grand Ole Opry's legendary stage, which had hosted everyone from Hank Williams to Taylor Swift, was suddenly transformed into his rehearsal space. Sound technicians scrambled to set up an additional microphone and adjust levels for his acoustic guitar, while Reba's band members graciously accommodated the last-minute addition to their carefully planned set list. Standing at center stage during the brief sound check, Michael felt the weight of the empty auditorium pressing down on him like a physical force. 1,800 seats stretched out before him in the darkness, each one representing someone who had paid handsomely for an evening of polished entertainment. In less than an hour, those seats would be filled with some of Nashville's most influential people, music industry executives, politicians, wealthy donors, and longtime fans who had specific expectations about what a Reba Mcentire concert should deliver. "You okay?" Reba asked, appearing beside him as technicians made final adjustments to the lighting and sound systems. "Terrified," Michael admitted honestly. "I haven't performed for a real audience in over 5 years, and even then it was elementary school children who were happy if I could play Happy Birthday without making mistakes." Reba laughed, a warm sound that seemed to fill the massive space with human warmth. "You know what I've learned in 30 years of doing this? The audience doesn't care about perfection. They care about connection. They want to feel something real, something that reminds them why music matters in their lives. You've got that in abundance. What if they don't accept me? Michael asked, voicing the fear that had been gnawing at him since Carter started organizing the impromptu rehearsal. What if they see a homeless man on their stage and decide this whole thing is inappropriate or disrespectful to the event? Then they'll learn something important about judging people by appearances, Reba replied firmly. And if they don't learn that lesson tonight, it won't be because we didn't try to teach it. The house lights began to dim as the audience settled into their seats, and Michael could hear the low murmur of conversation drifting from the theater. Somewhere out there, Nashville's social and cultural elite were expecting an evening of familiar entertainment, unaware that they were about to witness something unprecedented in the venue's storied history. Ladies and gentlemen, Reba's voice carried across the backstage area as she prepared to make her entrance. Tonight is going to be special. Trust me on that. Michael watched from the wings as Reba took the stage to thunderous applause, her presence immediately commanding the attention of every person in the auditorium. She opened with 3 of her biggest hits, establishing the comfortable rapport with her audience that had made her one of country music's most beloved performers. But even from his position in the wings, Michael could sense something different in her energy tonight, an anticipation, an excitement that suggested she was building toward something unexpected. You know, Reba said as the applause from her 3rd song faded, country music has always been about telling stories. Stories about real people facing real challenges, finding ways to survive and sometimes even thrive despite circumstances that might break lesser spirits. Tonight, I want to share a story with you that reminds us all why these songs matter. Michael felt his stomach clench with nervous energy as Reba began to tell his story, not all of it, and not with unnecessary details that would exploit his tragedy for dramatic effect, but enough to help the audience understand that they were about to hear something authentic rather than merely entertaining. 5 years ago, Reba continued, her voice carrying the practiced cadence of a master storyteller, a music teacher named Michael Dawson lost everything that mattered to him in a single tragic moment. His family, his home, his career, all gone in one devastating blow, but he didn't lose his music, and he didn't lose his ability to touch other people through song. Tonight, he's going to share that gift with all of us. The audience reaction was mixed, polite applause tinged with curiosity, and what Michael interpreted as skepticism. These were people accustomed to carefully orchestrated charity events where beneficiaries were presented as grateful but distant figures rather than flesh and blood human beings sharing the same stage as the headline performer. Please welcome Michael Dawson, Reba announced, and suddenly Michael found himself walking onto the most famous stage in country music, his borrowed guitar feeling both foreign and familiar in his hands. The stage lights were brighter than anything he'd ever experienced, creating a wall of illumination that made the audience invisible beyond the first few rows. But he could feel their collective attention like a living thing, 1,800 pairs of eyes focused on his every movement. Some faces in the front rows showed genuine curiosity. Others displayed the polite attention of people determined to be gracious, regardless of their private reservations. Good evening, Michael said into the microphone, his voice stronger than he'd expected it to be. Ms. Mcentire is being very kind in her introduction. The truth is, I'm probably the last person you expected to see on this stage tonight, and I understand if some of you are wondering what exactly is happening here. A few chuckles rippled through the audience, and Michael felt some of the tension in his shoulders begin to ease. These were still people, regardless of their wealth or social status, and people generally appreciated honesty over pretense. I lost my family 5 years ago, Michael continued, deciding that Reba's approach of direct emotional honesty was the only way forward. And in losing them, I lost myself for a while. I've spent the last 5 years learning that life can take away everything you think defines you, your job, your home, your sense of purpose, but it can't take away your ability to create something beautiful, something that connects you to other human beings. The audience had grown noticeably quieter, the social chatter and program rustling that typically accompanied charity event performances fading into attentive silence. Michael could sense their growing engagement, their transition from polite tolerance to genuine interest. This song is about love that survives loss, Michael said, settling his guitar into position. It's about holding on to hope when hope seems impossible. It's called Forever's Not Long Enough, and I wrote it for my wife Sarah and my son Tommy. The opening chords filled the auditorium, with a sound that seemed both intimate and universal, Michael's finger-picking pattern creating a musical foundation that spoke of careful craftsmanship and deep emotion. When his voice joined the guitar, carrying lyrics that had been born from genuine grief and tempered by hard-won acceptance, something shifted in the atmosphere of the Grand Ole Opry. This wasn't performance in the traditional sense. It was testimony, delivered by someone who had earned the right to speak about loss and survival through lived experience rather than artistic imagination. The song built slowly, each verse revealing another layer of emotion, each chorus returning to themes of gratitude and enduring love that resonated with universal human experience. Michael sang about Sarah's laugh echoing through their kitchen, about Tommy's small hands reaching for help with homework, about ordinary moments that had become precious beyond measure only after they were gone. But he also sang about the persistence of love beyond physical presence, about finding meaning in memory, about the possibility of hope even in the depths of despair. When the last note faded into the reverent silence of the auditorium, Michael looked up to see something extraordinary. The skeptical expressions in the front rows had transformed into something deeper: recognition, empathy, and the kind of emotional connection that reminded everyone present why music mattered in their lives. Several people were openly weeping, not from pity, but from genuine emotional response to art that had touched something real inside them. The applause, when it began, started slowly, but built into something thunderous and sustained. People weren't just clapping politely for a charity case who had been given a momentary spotlight. They were responding to a performer who had reminded them of music's power to heal, to connect, and to transform pain into something beautiful. It was the kind of ovation typically reserved for legendary performers at the height of their powers, and it seemed to surprise even Reba as she joined Michael on stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said as the applause finally began to subside, "that is why we support music education. That is why we believe every person deserves the chance to discover their voice. Because sometimes, if we are very lucky, we get to witness moments like this, moments when art and life and human connection come together to remind us what really matters." But as Michael stood beside one of country music's biggest stars, basking in applause from Nashville's elite, he had no idea that in the audience sat Derek Thompson, one of the most powerful music producers in the industry, a man whose next words would transform this single moment of triumph into something much larger and more permanent than anyone could have imagined. Derek Thompson had built his reputation by recognizing authentic talent in unexpected places, but even his experienced eye hadn't anticipated what he'd just witnessed. For 30 years, he'd been responsible for launching careers that had shaped American music, working with artists who had sold millions of records and filled stadiums across the world. But sitting in his premium seat at the Grand Ole Opry charity benefit, Derek found himself more moved by a homeless man's original song than he'd been by any performance in recent memory. As the applause finally subsided and Reba continued with her scheduled set, Derek quietly excused himself from his table and made his way backstage. His reputation opened doors that remained closed to most people, and within minutes, he found himself in the corridor where Michael sat on the equipment case, still processing what had just happened to him. "Mr. Dawson," Derek said, extending his hand with the confidence of someone accustomed to making life-changing offers. "My name is Derek Thompson. I run Heartland Records, and I'd like to talk with you about your future." Michael looked up at the distinguished man in the expensive suit, his mind still reeling from the evening's events. "I'm sorry, sir, but I think there might be some confusion. I'm not a professional musician. What happened tonight was just—" "What happened tonight?" Derek interrupted gently. "Was the most authentic piece of artistry I've heard in this town in a decade. I've been in this business long enough to know the difference between a moment and a movement. You, Mr. Dawson, have the potential to be a movement." The word seemed impossible to Michael, who 12 hours earlier had been worried about finding enough money for dinner. "I appreciate the sentiment, Mr. Thompson, but I think you might be overestimating what you heard. I'm a school teacher who's been out of work for 5 years. I don't know anything about the music industry or recording contracts or any of that world." Derek smiled, recognizing the humility that often accompanied genuine talent. "The best artists rarely do when they start. What they have is something more important. They have truth to tell, and the ability to tell it in a way that moves people. Everything else can be learned." Reba appeared in the corridor, having finished her final song and taken her bows. Her face was flushed with the excitement of a performance that had exceeded even her own expectations. "Derek Thompson," she said with genuine warmth, "I should have known you'd find your way back here. Are you trying to steal my discovery?" "I'm trying to make sure he doesn't disappear back into obscurity," Derek replied. "What happened out there tonight was lightning in a bottle, but lightning only matters if someone knows how to harness it." Michael found himself once again in the center of conversations that seemed to involve his future, but felt completely surreal. "Ms. Mcentire, Mr. Thompson, I can't express how grateful I am for tonight, but I think you're both getting carried away by the emotion of the moment. Tomorrow morning, this will all seem like a beautiful dream, and I'll go back to being who I really am." "And who do you think you really are?" Reba asked, settling beside him with the casual ease that had made her beloved by fans and colleagues alike. Michael considered the question seriously. "I'm a man who lost everything that mattered and has been trying to figure out how to rebuild some kind of meaningful life. Music has been my companion through that process, but I never imagined it could be anything more than personal therapy." "Therapy that moves people to tears," Derek observed. "Therapy that stops conversations and makes hardened industry professionals remember why they fell in love with music in the first place. Michael, what you have isn't common. In 30 years of producing records, I've worked with artists who have sold millions of albums, but never touched people the way you touched that audience tonight." The conversation was interrupted by Carter Williams, who appeared with a tablet in his hands and an expression of amazement. "You all need to see this," he said, turning the screen toward them. "The video of Michael's performance is already going viral. Someone in the audience posted it on social media, and it's been shared over 50,000 times in the last hour." Michael stared at the screen, watching himself perform on the Grand Ole Opry stage as viewed through someone's phone camera. The comments were scrolling by too fast to read individually, but he caught fragments of responses. "Who is this guy? Most beautiful song I've ever heard. This is what country music is supposed to be. Made me call my family. Hope this man gets the recognition he deserves." "This is what I was talking about," Derek said, his excitement growing as he scrolled through the responses. "This isn't just about one performance. This is about connecting with people on a level that transcends entertainment. They're not just watching a video, they're sharing it because it moved them, because they want other people to experience what they just felt." Reba nodded, recognizing the signs of something special unfolding. "Michael, honey, you've got a choice to make. You can treat tonight as a wonderful memory and go back to your old life, or you can trust us to help you build something new. But I want you to understand, this isn't charity. Derek doesn't offer record deals out of pity, and I don't invite people on tour because I feel sorry for them. This is about talent, pure and simple." Michael felt the weight of possibility pressing down on him like a physical force. 5 years ago, he would have understood exactly what such an opportunity meant and how to evaluate it. But 5 years of poverty and isolation had eroded his confidence in his own judgment about anything beyond basic survival. "What would it actually involve?" he asked Derek, trying to ground the conversation in practical reality. "Initially, we'd start with recording your original songs," Derek explained, shifting into business mode. "You mentioned you have a notebook of compositions. We'd work together to develop the strongest material, arrange it properly, and create an album that showcases your voice and your songwriting. The goal would be to capture the same emotional authenticity you demonstrated tonight, but in a studio setting that allows for wider distribution." "And then?" Michael pressed, needing to understand the full scope of what was being proposed. "Then we see how the world responds," Reba interjected. "But based on what I've seen tonight, both on stage and online, I think the world is ready for what you have to offer, which is why I want to ask you something else. Would you consider joining my tour as an opening act?" The question hung in the air like a challenge to everything Michael thought he knew about his own limitations and possibilities. Opening for Reba Mcentire meant performing in major venues across the country, reaching audiences of thousands rather than hundreds, establishing himself as a professional musician rather than a charity case who'd had one magical moment. "I don't have anything to wear," Michael said, immediately recognizing how trivial the concern sounded in the context of such a massive opportunity. Reba laughed, the sound carrying both affection and determination. "Honey, if wardrobe is your biggest concern, then we're going to get along just fine. Everything else can be figured out." Derek pulled out his business card and a pen, writing something on the back before handing it to Michael. "This is my personal number. I want you to think about this overnight, but don't think too long. Opportunities like this don't come around often, and when they do, they require decisive action." Michael looked down at the business card, feeling the weight of dreams he'd abandoned and possibilities he'd never allowed himself to imagine. What if I fail? What if tonight was just a fluke, and I can't recreate it in a studio or on a tour? "Then you fail having tried something extraordinary," Reba replied simply. "But honey, I've been doing this for 30 years, and I can tell you with absolute certainty, what happened tonight wasn't a fluke. That was years of musical training and life experience coming together at exactly the right moment. The question isn't whether you can do it again. The question is whether you're willing to try." 6 months later, Michael Dawson stood on the stage of Chicago's United Center, performing the final song of his opening set before Reba Mcentire's sold-out concert. The homeless man who had once sheltered behind dumpsters now commanded the attention of 20,000 people, his debut album climbing the country charts and his story inspiring similar acts of recognition and generosity across the entertainment industry. The recording process had been both challenging and therapeutic, working with Derek Thompson to craft arrangements that honored the emotional authenticity of his original compositions while making them accessible to radio audiences. Forever's Not Long Enough had become a surprise hit, reaching the top 10 on country radio and crossing over to adult contemporary stations that rarely played country music. But perhaps more importantly, Michael had used his newfound platform to establish the Second Chance Music program, working with homeless shelters and community centers to provide musical instruments and instruction to people whose circumstances had forced them to abandon their artistic dreams. The program wasn't a foundation or formal charity. It was simply Michael showing up with his guitar and his story, demonstrating that talent and dignity persist even in the darkest circumstances. As he took his final bow in Chicago, Michael caught sight of a familiar face in the front row. Ray Sullivan, the security guard whose decision to listen rather than dismiss had set everything in motion. Ray had become something of a celebrity himself, featured in multiple news stories about the importance of recognizing talent regardless of its packaging. Tonight, he was Reba's special guest, having been invited to witness how far his simple act of human decency had reached. The transformation in Michael's life was profound, but hadn't erased the grief that had shaped him. He still thought about Sarah and Tommy every day, still carried their memory in every song he performed, but he'd learned that healing didn't require forgetting, that honoring the dead could coexist with embracing life, that survival could evolve into something that resembled hope. "Ladies and gentlemen," Michael said into the microphone as the applause began to fade, 5 years ago I thought my story was over. I thought I'd lost everything that mattered, and that the rest of my life would be about managing that loss. But I learned something important. Our stories don't end when we think they do. Sometimes they're just beginning a new chapter that we never saw coming." He paused, looking out at the sea of faces that represented not just an audience, but a community of people who had embraced his music and his message. Tonight, somewhere in this city, there's someone sitting alone thinking their best days are behind them. Maybe they've lost a job, lost a relationship, lost hope itself. If that person is listening, I want them to know, your story isn't over either. Sometimes the most beautiful chapters of our lives begin with the words, "I never thought I could," followed by the discovery that we can. As Michael left the stage to thunderous applause, Reba waited in the wings with a smile that spoke of artistic satisfaction and human pride. "You ready for this?" she asked, nodding toward the main stage where 20,000 people were chanting her name. "Ready as I'll ever be," Michael replied, understanding that she was asking about more than just the evening's performance. He was ready for whatever came next, success or failure, recognition or obscurity, triumph or disappointment. He'd learned that readiness wasn't about being prepared for specific outcomes, but about being open to possibilities he couldn't imagine. The story of Michael Dawson's transformation from homeless musician to touring artist would be told and retold across the country, inspiring countless acts of recognition and second chances. But for Michael himself, the real victory wasn't the record deal or the tour or the financial security. It was the rediscovery of purpose, the knowledge that his voice still mattered, and the understanding that sometimes the end of one story is simply the beginning of another. As Reba took the stage to begin her own set, Michael stood in the wings and softly strummed his guitar, no longer the battered instrument of a desperate man, but the tool of an artist who had found his way home to music, to meaning, and to hope itself.